Hola a todos, bienvenido a nuestro podcast. My name is Michelle Wong, my Chinese name is Wong Mei Ching, and I'm a senior majoring in MCB.
Hi, my name is Amber, my Chinese name is Mengwan Bo, I'm a first year and I'm planning to major in MCB as well.
你好, my name is Russell, my Chinese name is Li Yitian, and I'm a fourth year poli-sci major.
Hi everybody, my name is Kelvin, my Chinese name is Zhou Zhengjin, and I'm a second year intending to study cognitive science.
Our topic for the podcast is Chinese immigration to Latin America, with an emphasis on Peru.
We've interviewed my grandfather, Paulo Hop, about his experience migrating to Peru, starting a business and building a new life. We also consulted Professor Locke Siu about the history of Asian diaspora in the late 19th century, specifically in Latin America.
Throughout the project, we pull information from various websites and sources to help supplement our podcast.
In this podcast, we'll be exploring race relations, politics, and many other factors that impacted Chinese immigration patterns to Latin America.
First, we called my grandpa and talked to him about his life in Peru. Hola, Gonggong. Can you tell us about your journey to Peru and how you started your business?
Por mi parte, yo venía a Perú. Yo no sabía Perú cómo era. 15 años salí a China, porque China ese tiempo de comunistas, muy difícil. Yo 15 años salí y vino a Macao. Ya mi papá está solicitando que venga a Perú. Entonces ya yo estoy pensando Perú está en mejor situación que Macao. Entonces yo año 1957 a Perú, pero Perú una situación muy difícil porque llegó a un sitio que viene a Perú una diferencia. Y mi papá en una tienda chiquito no tiene mucho, entonces yo pensaba que tenía una vida mejor que Macao, que Ucora o Camino, por eso yo quería regresar porque allá nada mucho mejor, acá está. Pero poco a poco yo lo veo que la gente que está en Perú han ganado plata. Entonces yo trabajaba en Hong Kong, en Macao, y allá muy difícil, pero hoy han ganado plata. Entonces acá yo lo veo mucho más fácil que Hong Kong y Macao, por eso me quedo yo sin plata, no habla castellano y no tiene profesional. Entonces yo, ¿cómo tiene que ser? Ya, primero, yo le he dicho a mi papá, yo voy a trabajar 2 años acá, me voy a buscar trabajo. Yo año 1960, yo pedí, mi papá ya me voy a Lima a buscar trabajo. Ya un poco por pila, yo fui a Lima a buscar trabajo. Felizmente he encontrado una empresa, necesita gente para invitadores de empresas chinas, ¿no? Dueño chino. Necesita un habilitador para tener una tienda en Callao, una tienda grande para hacer que venda zapatos a Callao. Entonces, y de tiempo, en Callao hay mucho movimiento, mucho negocio, no sé, tienda grande, y tiene todo marca. Para mí, esa es mi oportunidad. Pero yo trabajando duro, yo jalando a la gente, vendiendo bastante zapatos, así poco a poco, mi tienda yendo 500, 600, 800 pares cada día lo vende. Yo trabajé 3 años, 1963 hasta 63 yo terminé el trabajo, yo ganaba $11,000. Entonces con ese capital ya puedo fabricar zapatos. Yo ya voy a hacer zapatos calidad, porque ese tiempo Perú es zapato muy duro, modelo muy antiguo. Yo ya voy a fabricar zapatos bora y suave, ya comienza a fabricar ya más flexible, así ya iniciar 64, ya 65 ya gana buena plata. Ya tengo bastante venta, mis zapatos todo el mundo le gusta, entonces comienzo a trabajar 1 año en la casa y yo conseguí mi señora, yo quiero esa mujer para ser mi compañera de vida con ella. Ya comienza, mis zapatos comienza su producción, está fabricando 400 pares diarios, ya después ya sale tu tía Leila a comprar mi casa, nació tu mamá, Nacía Annie, nacía Tommy, un cuatro hijos, así poco a poco creciendo, creciendo. Entonces yo, mi familia, todo bien. Yo tengo una empresa, ya tengo ahora ya tengo más de 1,000 personas. Yo ya tengo buena posición, ahora ya tengo 85 años, yo estoy feliz. Esa es la vida, Michelle. No es fácil, pero tampoco no es difícil, ¿no? Acá mucho más oportunidad para ganar la plata, pero ahora China está mucho mejor. Ahora ya no ven ni 5 o 6 años, ya no llega ni un chino a Perú. Más bien la gente joven, ya tiene 10 años, está regresando a China, porque ya China ya está bien, por eso acá Perú solamente vende chino, son turistas, nada de vender que hace acá, no, porque ahora muy difícil, Argentina mucho más rápido. Yo soy trabajador, yo cumplo como trabajador. Yo soy dueño y cumple como dueño, todo el mundo me quiere, entonces en fábrica no fracaso, no hay problema, ¿entiendes?
Mm-hmm.
Tiene que ser cosas buenas, ¿ya?
Mm-hmm.
¿Ok? Ya,
Ya.
cualquier cosa me llama.
Ya, gracias, Gunggong. Chao,
Ya, ok.
Gunggong.
Cuídate.
Ya,
Ya.
chao.
Ya, chao.
Next, we had the privilege of chatting with Professor Loxiu and getting more historical context about Chinese migration to Latin America. Hi, Professor Loxiu. One of our questions was, why did the Chinese continue to move to Latin America and decide to stay there even after their labor contracts had ended?
So the Chinese moved to Latin America really, to be honest, as early as the 1600s. And they didn't really go there, with the idea of migrating, but really they were there as part of sailors on ships that were, routing between Manila, Philippines, all the way to Acapulco, Mexico, on the Manila galleon trade. And so that was a global circulation of ships that sailed every year. And some of the Chinese were working on the ships along with Filipinos. And you began to have sort of migrants going to Latin America, landing in Mexico during that period. And that continued, throughout history in smaller numbers, but the largest number of Chinese going to Latin America was during the period of mid-1800s. And they went there primarily as laborers, for plantations. They did have contracts. The contracts, in Peru and Cuba were more similar to one another. There were other sets of contracts, for the British colonies, Trinidad, Jamaica, etc. So you had sort of influx of Chinese laborers. They stay there, primarily because, let's just say that if they survived their contract, they remained because they didn't really, they weren't able to get enough money or accrue enough capital to actually return to China. Many of them did want to, but they just could not afford it. The fact is, with the contracts, many of them were earning very little. They were often cheated, from actually even getting money, and their contracts were extended indefinitely, oftentimes. So that was a condition that they were facing, and they remained. Some of them were able to intermarry primarily with slaves, Black slaves, who were working alongside them on the plantations. So you have large populations of racially mixed Chinese in many of these areas. In Cuba, in Peru, that was also the case. Many of the Chinese actually, after finishing their contracts, would run to the highlands and settled, in some of the communities among indigenous people in Peru as well, and intermarried, into those communities. There were, small pockets of Chinatowns that were already forming by the late 1800s in Latin America. So
our next question is, why did the Chinese choose to immigrate to Latin America over the US? Was it because of the Chinese Exclusion Act in America?
I mean, yes, there was the Exclusion Act in the US, but many of the Chinese actually chose to go to Latin America as well because they had already existing family there. So given that, the Chinese, usually they're done by homeland or hometown associations, right? The chain migrations that happen are within sort of extended family or people in a village. So you would have, people who were from your village already in Latin America. And so those routes were opened up, early on in the 1800s when you have the first wave. And so people did choose to go to Latin America oftentimes for family reunification and economic opportunities too, I have to say.
Were they necessarily better than economic opportunities in China or in the US? Like, how did those compare?
It depends on the time period, and it depends on sort of the kind of work you were looking for. I think throughout the United States and the Americas, there was a tremendous need for cheap labor, menial labor, right? So for constructing infrastructures, the railroad, for instance, that happened, throughout Latin America and the United States. So you had railroad construction by the Chinese that happened there. You also had sort of a merchant class that were going to service, the Chinese settlements that were there as well. So in Mexico, for instance, there were considerably many more merchants that went to the northern part of Mexico as that started small businesses, grocers, laundromats, restaurants, and things like that, because there was already a kind of growing working class, not only of Chinese, but American capitalists too. So you have that, in Peru, I guess in different times, there were different demands for work. But many of them, were going there as plantation farmers, plantation workers, small mom and pop sort of grocery stores, restaurants. I mean, every kind of service industry, and then it eventually turned into trade as well. From 1882 to 1965, the U.S. was relatively closed, in terms of having new Chinese laborers go. So while you might have merchants that are able to enter, into the U.S. at that time. There wasn't that availability for laborers. So in Latin America, it was wide open in that sense. There were eventually sort of exclusion acts that came into place throughout Latin America, but there were tremendous sort of loopholes, that they were able to bypass and arrive to those countries.
I think that perfectly transitions to our next question. Were there pushes for deportation of Chinese Latin Americans? And how did anti Chinese sentiment in Latin America compare to that of the US?
Just like there were riots and anti-Chinese movements in the US, that was also the case throughout Latin America. Much of the policies that occurred in Latin America in many ways follow those of the United States. So the immigration laws, as they become more strict in the US and more restrictive, the Latin American countries also did the same thing. Sometimes it was, out of pressure from the US to do so, because they understood that some of the Chinese were actually going to Latin America and then entering into the United States. But oftentimes there were already sort of local national sentiments of anti-Chinese brewing in those particular countries as well, that eventually led to, the riots and displacement. One of the biggest events, in Mexico, for instance, is the riot that happened in Mexico, and over 300 people were killed and murdered in one day. And so this is the Torreon riot. And that is, by far, is probably one of the worst anti-Chinese violence that occurred, in the hemisphere. You had, just throughout, history in Latin America, there was so much sort of anti-Chinese legislation, sort of everyday forms of anti-Chinese hate and violence. As we see here in the US now, it also happens in Latin America. So, of course, there is, of course, a differential kind of treatment of Chinese depending on your class position as well. So people who are more impoverished in the lower economic class are more prone to be discriminated against, to experience the kind of violence, versus the people who are more well off and economically mobile. I think there is a different kind of treatment, along class lines for Chinese Americans, both in the US as well as in Latin America.
Well, thank you, Professor Siu and Gung for joining us today. If you would like to learn more about Chinese Latin Americans, tune in to our full-length podcast. But for now, gracias, and we hope you enjoyed it.